If you didn't get a lesson, be sure and get one from the back. Before we start, sometimes we pick on certain groups of people. Tonight, usually it's the seniors we like to pick on. We're going to pick on a different group tonight, pregnant women and their husbands. You know, in my medical career, I delivered almost 2,000 babies, and I quit when I decided that I needed sleep more than I needed excitement. Anyway, but I wish I'd had this back then. This is questions of a pregnant woman or her husband to the doctor. And here's the doctor's answers. First question, should I have a baby after 35? The answer, no, 35 children is enough. Question, I'm 2 months pregnant now. When will my baby move? Well, hopefully right after he finishes high school or college. What is the most reliable method to determine a baby's sex? Childbirth. My wife is 5 months pregnant and so moody that sometimes she's borderline irrational. Answer. So what's your question? My childbirth instructor says it's not pain I'll feel during labor, but pressure. Is that right? Well, yes, in the same way that a tornado might be called an air current. When is the best time to get an epidural? Right after you find out you're pregnant. Is there any reason I have to be in, this is the husband, is there any reason I have to be in the delivery room while my wife is in labor? Well, not unless the word alimony means something to you. Is there anything I should avoid while recovering from pregnancy? I'm sorry. Is there anything I should avoid while recovering from childbirth? Yes, pregnancy. Do I have to have a baby shower? Well, not if you change the baby's diaper real quickly. Our baby was born last week. When will my wife begin to feel and act normal again? When the kids are in college. Okay, we're in the book of Esther. We are in the 6th lesson and the 7th chapter. We always do a review in case you've not been here for some of the lessons, or also to kind of help you remember. You know, all of us don't have great memories. And that kind of brings us up to where we are tonight, so you'll get a context of what we're talking about. So very quickly, a review of the book of Esther to this point. In chapter 1, King Xerxes, and the older versions called him Ahasuerus, which is the Jewish name. Xerxes is the Persian name. He's the king of Persia, the largest kingdom in the world at that time. This is about 486 years before Christ. Had a wife named Vashti the queen, and she was deposed for not obeying him. Chapter 2, Esther, through a queen contest, so to speak, becomes the queen. Esther is a Jew. She had been raised by her uncle Mordecai, and because Jews were not thought of favorably, he had her not reveal that she was a Jew. So she's the wife of Xerxes, but Xerxes does not know that she's a Jew. At the end of chapter 2, Mordecai, who is an officer for the king, he's in the king's employ, and he works at the king's gate, where business was conducted back then. He uncovers a plot to assassinate the king and lets it be known to Queen Esther. She tells the king, and the two guards that were doing that were killed. Chapter 3, this is 5 years later, Xerxes the king names a man named Haman as the prime minister. So he's the number 2 guy in the largest kingdom of the world. And Haman obviously has to come in and out of the palace, and as he passes the gate, Mordecai the Jew refuses to bow down to him. It's Persian court etiquette. This is not a thing like in Daniel, where Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow because Nebuchadnezzar actually declared himself a god. In Persia, the rulers did not declare themselves gods. This is just Persian court etiquette, that you bowed to people that were of higher authority to you in government. So everybody was bowing but Mordecai, and Mordecai knew the lineage of Haman. Haman was a descendant of King Agag, who was an Amalekite king, and hundreds of years earlier, God had tried to get King Saul to destroy them all. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but God had told the Jews to remember the sins of the Amalekites, and so that's why Mordecai would not bow down to him. So Haman plots to kill not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. So he goes to the king and tells the king there's a group of people. He doesn't mention the Jews. He just tells him there's a group of people in the kingdom that are not paying their taxes, that are rebellious, and says, let me go ahead and just get rid of them, and I'll pay you 10,000 talents of silver, and we'll be done with this deal. And the king says, here's my ring, sign the proclamation, and the deal's done. And in Persia at that time, a king's proclamation was non-revocable. So then Haman casts lots to see what day he's going to have his soldiers do this, and the lot falls on a day 11 months later. And the proclamation is sent out throughout the kingdom, so all the Jews find out that they are going to be killed 11 months later. Chapter 4, Mordecai appeals to Queen Esther. She's initially reluctant to do anything because the king has not called for her in a long time, and a person that goes before the king without being accepted can be put to death. And so Mordecai then sends a copy of this decree to her because she had not heard about this. And so that convinces her, and Mordecai passes on the word to her that you became queen for such a time as this. In other words, you're not queen for your own glory. God puts you here to carry out his plans. And so Esther replies, I'll have all the Jews fast totally for 3 days, and then I'll go before the king, and if he doesn't accept me, if I perish, I perish. In chapter 5, Esther does go before the king. He does pull out his scepter, so she is accepted. She's not put to death. And the king asks what she wants. Now, she doesn't really talk about this plot that Haman has, but she says, I have prepared a banquet for you and Haman. Will you come to my banquet? And so they come to her banquet the next day, and then, of course, the king asks again, what is it that you want? Why did you come before me? And again, she doesn't tell him. And so Haman, though, is excited because he's been to a banquet with just he and the queen and himself, and he's puffed up with pride. But then as he leaves the banquet, he passes Mordecai at the gate. Mordecai doesn't bow, everybody else does. And so he goes home, and he's all hot and bothered because Mordecai just refuses to bow to him. So his wife gives him some great advice. She said, you have the power and you have the authority to take care of this. This Mordecai problem you have that's bothering you so much, you don't have to wait 11 months to kill him. Why don't you just construct a 75-foot gallows and take care of Mordecai? So he thinks that's a pretty good idea. Anyways, from the next chapter, chapter 6, we're seeing God start to move. At this point, God's kind of been silent through this story. He's not mentioned, but as we mentioned, he's kind of like the rudder on the ship. He's unseen, but he's guiding this story to perfect his plans. So the night after that first banquet, while all the city's sleeping, guess what? The king can't sleep. So God gives the king insomnia. So he calls his servants in, and he has them read the history of the kingdom to him, I'm sure hoping that'll put him to sleep. But instead, they come to the part where 5 years earlier, Mordecai has saved his life. That's part of the history of the kingdom. And the king says, wait, what was done for Mordecai to thank him for saving my life? And they said, nothing was done for Mordecai. So by then it's about dawn, and so the king is bothered that nothing was done for Mordecai. So he hears someone coming into the palace, and he asks his servants, who is it that's coming in? Well, it turns out Haman's coming in to tell the king about how he's going to kill Mordecai. And the king says, Haman, I have a question for you. What should I do to a man that I want to honor? And of course, Haman, being the selfish, proud person that he is, thinks, he must be talking about me. So he gives this elaborate scheme of everything the king should do to honor this man that he wants to honor. He says, put the king's robes on him, put the king's crown on him, put him on the king's horse, and get one of your highest nobles to lead him throughout the city, the capital city of Susa, proclaiming, this is what the king would want for a man he wants to honor. This is a man of great honor, so everybody must honor him. And the king says, that is a great idea, Haman. I want you to do that for Mordecai. Isn't that great? I just love that. I just love that. So you can imagine Mordecai realizes that he's in big trouble because he has now gotten the king through through stealth to pronounce a proclamation to kill all the Jews, and now the man he wants to honor the most is a Jew because Haman knows he's a Jew. Anyway, so now he goes home and tells his friends, and the Bible says what happened to him. And we talked about how proud people are like this. You know, they're never the cause of a problem. Everything that happens to them is poor, pitiful me, look what happened to me. And that's what Haman does with his family and his friends. And apparently for the first time he tells them that this Mordecai that's been bugging him is a Jew, because they say, oops, if this guy's a Jew, you're in trouble. So they knew something about God's protection of the Jews and how the Jews were a favored people. So they tell him, you're in bad shape if you've been plotting against Mordecai and he's a Jew. Anyway, about that time, the king's eunuchs show up his house to bring him to the second banquet, because at the first banquet, when the king said, Esther, what do you want me to do for you? And rather than tell him about this plot of Haman, she says, I would like you and Haman to come to another banquet I prepared for you tomorrow. So that's where we are tonight when we start chapter 7. We're beginning the second banquet. Okay, verse 1 and 2 of chapter 7, they're on your lesson sheet, and tonight all of these scriptures are from the English Standard Version, which is my favorite version. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, again the king said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. So we mentioned last time as the eunuchs came to Haman's house and led him up to the second banquet, that, you know, the night before he had this 75-foot, we're talking about 7.5-story foot gallows. And we've mentioned how the Persians didn't hang people by the neck. You know, the older versions say hanged. The newer versions talk about impale. The way they mainly executed people was they would impale them with a large pointed stick and then hang the body up for the public to see as a public declaration, so that hopefully to dissuade other people from crimes. So Haman had created this 75-foot gallows or post to hang Haman's body on. So you can just know, as the eunuchs, he left his house and this thing is right in front of Haman's house, that Haman kind of looked at it thinking, I think I made a mistake, right? Anyway, so now he's at the banquet, and he has no clue why Queen Esther has invited him again to the banquet. But he does know, but he's not talking about it, that he's got a Mordecai problem, because he has created this proclamation to kill all the Jews, including Mordecai, and now the king has honored Mordecai as the most honored person. So for the third time, Esther knows it's coming. The question's coming again. The king, Xerxes asked Queen Esther, what is it that you want? I'll give you anything you want, up to half the kingdom. Remember, the first time was when she came to him uninvited in the palace, and he held out his scepter. The second time was at the day before at the first banquet, but she had never answered him, because I believe she, was waiting for the move of God to say, now's the time. Now's the time that I want you to speak. And so our point on this verse is that part of God's godly wisdom is knowing when we need to listen and when we need to speak. We don't need to just, run our mouth off and tell everything we know, and first time we hear something, repeat it, and kind of jump in there. We need to wait on God. I think God will help us know when to say things and when to bite our tongue and when to hold back. Because if you think about it, if she had answered the king the first time he asked, even though it was a big burden on her heart that this proclamation was to kill all the Jews, it would have been before he had the night where he had the insomnia and read the Chronicles about Mordecai and then led to the honoring of Mordecai. So that would have been premature. If she had answered him the second time, that would have been before Haman had time to build the gallows. And that would have been premature. So you see how waiting on the Lord brings about the fullness of time to where it's the proper time. So as we said, this is God, the rudder of the ship, guiding this story to its proper ending. A verse we heard in our Sunday school class 2 or 3 weeks ago was Proverbs 18:21, that death and life are in the power of the tongue. You know, there's an old saying sticks and stones will never hurt my bones, but we all know that's obviously very, very untrue. That as Solomon tells us in the Proverbs, death and life are in the power of the tongue. And so Esther's showing us that here as she's wisely, finally going to reveal what's been on her heart. I bring out Ecclesiastes 3:1 and 7. You know, we talked about when we studied the book of Ezra that Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that one of the reasons Ezra is so highly thought of among the Jews is because when they were in captivity in Persia, he was a scribe, he's a priest, he's a historian, but he set up synagogues throughout Persia so the Jews would have a place to worship and a place to continue to learn the Scriptures. And then he himself was a scribe, and he made he was the first scribe to make copies of the Torah. And he did that so all these synagogues could have a copy of the Torah so the Jews could learn. And so I believe that probably Esther had been taught by Mordecai from the Jewish writings beforehand. And one of those is great King Solomon in Ecclesiastes. He said, "For everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And then verse 7 says, "A time to keep silent and a time to speak." So that's kind of what we're talking about here, that Esther recognized there was a time to keep silent, and then there comes a time to speak. So now we're at the second banquet, just the three people around the table that are reclining on their couches around the table, King Xerxes, Queen Esther, and Haman. And she knows the question is coming. And she knows it's no longer time to be silent. She knows it's time to speak. And don't you know, in her chest, her heart is beating hard because she knows that how she answers this question and how the king responds will determine the outcome for her people, the Jews. So sure enough, King Xerxes opens the door the third time and she speaks. Verse 3 and 4. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." So remember, Xerxes at this point didn't know Esther was a Jew, and Haman had been careful not to tell Xerxes that this group of people that he got the king to make a proclamation about was the Jews. And Haman, up to this point, didn't know Esther was a Jew. All right? So notice her diplomacy, her sensitivity. You know, if it was only a matter of my people being sold into slavery, that would be a trivial thing. I wouldn't bring it up to you for such a great king. So I've read several commentators on this to kind of see what she was meaning, but the one I agree with the most is that I think she was appealing to the king in his interest in the power of the kingdom. Well, that's what kings are interested in, is keeping their kingdom intact, enlarging their kingdom, keeping their kingdom powerful. He's the custodian of the kingdom. And so she's appealing to him on that platform. She's basically saying, Xerxes, you know there's more than 1 million Jews in your kingdom, and that we conduct business, we pay taxes, we've helped the commerce, and so it would be a big loss to your kingdom to have these Jews annihilated. And so it's like, King, there's a plot out there to annihilate all of my people. And it's going to cost your kingdom a lot, and it's going to cost you your queen. Back when we were studying Ezra, I used a chess game as an example for one of the lessons about the hand of God. And talking about costing you your queen. And in the game of chess, it's like there's two armies, and you have the king and the queen. On either side of the king and the queen is called a bishop. Okay? Now, of course, the army that wins is the one that just kills or destroys the other army's king, but still there's points allowed to the different pieces to their strengths. Well, the bishops are considered the advisors to the king and queen, and they're given a point value of 3. The queen is a point value of 8. And so we're saying Haman, in the king's mind, here's a guy that's important. He's worth about 3 points, but the queen is worth 8. And Esther's saying, there's a proclamation that you have made, king, that's going to cost you your queen. And Haman, Xerxes knows she's a lot more important to him than Haman is. So in his defense, yeah, he did that, and he didn't really question Haman enough about this proclamation, and if you think about the king, he's got 127 provinces. You can't imagine how many people each day are coming to him with issues. Haman's not the only advisor. Who knows if on that day back in chapter 2, how many petitions came to him that day? Who knows how many edicts or proclamations he made on that one day? Who knows what other pressing national matters were on his mind? Plus, he totally trusted Haman. That's why he put him in that position. So here's a guy he totally trusts who comes to him with what seems like a logical proposition. So he says, yeah, go do it, take care of that issue, and I've got other stuff, on my plate. So I'm sure, if we think about Xerxes, he was just simply trusting Haman. Unfortunately, he was trusting the wrong guy. He was trusting a guy who was power hungry, who was proud, who really only cared about himself and his own pride, because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. He wanted to destroy the whole nation of the Jews. But all of a sudden, things change. God moves. And once more we bring up the verse, Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water. I guess I need to read verse 5 there. Then King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he that he's dared to do this? In other words, you're saying there's a person that has made a proclamation, that's got me to make a proclamation, to destroy all of your people and you. Who is this guy? And so this is where God moves. Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. So just like God can move an entire nation. Pastor in his last day sermon talks about how Israel in 1948 was made a nation in one day. Never before in the history of the world has a nation become a nation in one day. It's always been a process. But God can move kings, he can move nations, and he still moves today like he moved back in Bible times. God is not limited by time and space. We are, as humans, limited by time and space. God is not limited by the visible or the invisible. He lives in this realm that transcends all, and we're going to talk about that kind of at the end of our lesson. because we've kind of talked about throughout this book of Esther God's timing and waiting on God and the silence of God, and how do we deal with this? How do Esther and Mordecai have dealt with the silence of God as all this has been building up into what seemed like a disaster that was coming. But when he moves, and hang on, it's going to be exciting. So the moment has come, and I can see Queen Esther, when Xerxes says, "Who is this guy?" You can just see him there around this table. I don't know how big it was. There's 3 of them. I can just see her pointing her finger. Can't you see that? Verse 6, and Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So this is when Haman finds out that Esther's a Jew too. Bad news for Haman, right? So the courageous Esther exposes Haman as both a traitor to the king as well as an enemy to the Jews. He gets the surprise of his life. Because remember, when he told his family, his wife and his friends, that Mordecai was a Jew, they said, "Man, you've done the wrong thing. You've bitten off a bite you shouldn't have bit off of." So just know that Mordecai was a Jew, he knew he was in trouble. Now he finds out that Esther is a Jew. So he's really in trouble now. Not only is he getting rid of Mordecai, he's getting rid of the king's wife. So life has been awfully good for Haman until the last 24 to 36 hours. He was number 2 in the kingdom. He was powerful. He was wealthy. But then yesterday he had to lead Mordecai's horse through the city, telling everybody how great Mordecai was. And now the queen's pointing her finger at him, accusing him of treachery. But we're cheering on, aren't we? We're cheering him. We're cheering Esther on because we've been wanting justice this whole time. Here we are, 6th lesson of this, and finally we're getting some justice. We want the bad guy caught. Maybe I don't know if you ever watched a movie where it didn't end right. The bad guy doesn't get caught or something like that, and it just kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and you think, maybe I didn't see that right. Let's play this again, But when the bad guy gets caught, we're glad, because why? That gives us hope. When the bad guy's caught, it gives us hope that there is justice in this world. And so in this story here, we're finally getting some justice for this evil Haman. Okay, verse 7. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. Remember, we showed you pictures from archaeology of that garden back in the first lesson. The garden around the palace was 250 acres. And it had plant specimens from all over the kingdom, which the kingdom went from Ethiopia, south of Egypt, on the southwest, to what's now Turkey on the northwest, past India and Pakistan on the east. Massive, massive kingdom. So he had brought in plant specimens from all over that to be able to show his guests, his dignitaries, all the different plants that they probably had never seen before. He brought in animals from all over the kingdom, and this was the Persian Zoological Gardens were kind of the first. They and the Egyptians both kind of did the first what we call zoos in the world. They had to have these caged animals from all over the world that were strange, so that their guests, the king's guests, could just marvel at these plants and trees and animals. And they had reflecting ponds, and this was all irrigated. It was just amazing. Anyway, so this is where he's going out of the palace because he's so upset he's got to think about this. And I can just see him going to one of those reflecting ponds. It didn't have a lot of mirrors back then, but I can just see him looking at the reflecting pond. Remember, he had lost one queen. Remember Vashti? He lost one queen from being stupid. Okay. So now he's looking at that reflecting pond, and he think, I'm going to lose another queen, and this one I really love, from just being an idiot. From trusting this Haman that I didn't see through. And I'm going to be known around my kingdom as a 2-time loser. And I'm going to lose reputation because I can't seem to keep a queen, and this time it's because of a proclamation I signed myself that's non-revocable, that my queen's going to be killed. How stupid is that? So he's out there thinking about what to do. Verse 8, and the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. As I mentioned, they didn't sit in chairs like we do. They kind of reclined on couches as they ate around low tables, kind of like you may have seen pictures about even in the time of Jesus. That's kind of how they ate. So he was falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So Haman knows the other shoe has dropped. If you were here last lesson, we talked about the other shoe dropping and the origin of that saying. So the king's left the room. He knows he's in bad shape. He's only got one person to beg for his life, so he's falling on the queen's couch to beg for his life. The king happens to come back in, and he sees him on the queen's couch. He thinks he's assaulting the queen. And it's interesting, I looked up that word falling on the couch. It's the very same word, Hebrew word, is back in chapter 3, verse 7, where it says Haman was casting lots to determine the day he would have the Jews killed. So he was, the dice-like things, we kind of showed you some pictures that they used to determine the days and the weeks and the months. So he was throwing them down to determine the fate. And so here, he himself is casting himself down on the couch to determine his fate. Interesting, isn't it? So the king comes back in and sees Haman falling on the queen's couch and thinks he's assaulting the queen. And as he speaks, it says the guards covered Haman's face. To help me kind of understand the context of this, I've been, when I exercise and walk, and I've been listening to some podcasts on the history of the kings of Persia and their court customs and kind of the customs of the land. It's really been helpful to kind of get some background. There's a lot of, as I mentioned before, we're late enough in history to where there's a lot of world history that's been written down that we can discover through the Greeks and the Persians both. And so a couple of things here. In Persian courts, lying to a government official was a capital offense. Just lying to a government official was a capital offense. And so what the king had discovered here was that Haman had, and you can lie by commission or omission. So you can lie by not telling something you know, or you can lie by telling something that's not true. So basically the king had discovered that Haman had lied to him because it was not, the king is well aware of the Jews. They're a very prominent group in the kingdom. They do pay their taxes. As we mentioned, they were famous for their business acumen, and they were very good citizens. So he knew that Haman had lied to him about this group that was rebellious and wasn't paying their taxes. And then he had omitted the fact that they were the Jews. So he lied in commission and omission both. So that was a capital offense. And then assaulting the queen was a capital offense. And so basically Haman has brought his own judgment down on him, and he knows it. He knows he's committed capital offenses. And so the other thing that I learned from these podcasts I listened to, that was when a man was condemned to die in a Persian court, as soon as the judge pronounced the sentence, they put a sack over his head. And the purpose was that the last thing he would, and the sack was kept until he was executed. He never saw another thing or another person. And the purpose was that the last vision he had on this earth was the judge who pronounced the sentence. And so that's why it says right here, Haman's face was covered. Because basically the king gave the nod or whatever to the, in other words, this guy's it. So they put the sack over his head. That means he's out of here. Okay, verse 9 and 10. Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, The gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet. A cubit's 18 inches. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So I'm sure, we mentioned that at the beginning of this story, that the king's eunuchs came to Haman's house to collect him for the second banquet. I'm sure that was Harbana, because he'd kind of noticed this. It's kind of hard to miss a 75-foot gallows. Kind of in a town that, even though it was the capital of Susa, probably didn't have any 7-story tall buildings in it. And he got this thing anyway. So Harbana probably had noticed that and figured out what it was for. And so he says, by the way, King, there's some 7.5-story gallows in front of Haman's house you might find useful. So apparently they impaled him and hung him on top of that for all the world to see. Anyway, so Haman gets his just due. So what I want to finish the lesson with is kind of talking about waiting on God, waiting on God's timing. One of the things we said in one of the previous lessons is that while we are waiting, God is at work. God is at work in our waiting. And that's what we have a hard time grasping sometimes, because we are impatient. We're human. We want things to happen when we want them to happen. We want them to happen when we think they should happen. And I kind of liken it to microwaves. We kind of live in a microwave generation, to where we want everything to happen in 15 seconds or less. I have people come to me in the office and they'll say, Doc, I've been sick for 3 weeks and I'm leaving on a cruise tomorrow. I need to get well today. Well, good luck. Anyway, so this is an illustration I came across recently that I think is really good, to trying to put in a word picture kind of what we are in, how we live versus how God is. Okay, so let's kind of go through this, and obviously it's not perfect, but I think it's a pretty good illustration. The illustration is that picture a lake, and so your life is a lake, okay? And so you're in the middle of the lake swimming, so that's your life. You're going through this lake swimming, and you're moving through life, but you have a fog that's covering you. So you really can't see beyond that fog that's over you. So you can't see ahead of you. You can't see behind you, but you're continuing to move through this lake, which is your life. So the tiny space that you're in as you're swimming is the present. That's today. That's right now. Now, you remember the past, but you look back and the fog prevents you from seeing the past, but you remember it. And you wonder about the future, but the fog prevents you from seeing the future. So you just keep swimming as you're going through your life. So basically that fog element over you is you're kind of trapped in the present by this fog. And each of us are kind of that way, okay? Now, at times in our life when we feel like God is moving or God is no longer silent, it's like the fog lifts a little bit and we can kind of get more perception about our life and how things will work out. But you see, the thing about God is not trapped in a fog on a lake. He's not even confined to the lake, because the lake is time. So God is above all of that. So when we look at our lives, we kind of see our lives as a movie. You think of a movie and you have the beginning, the middle, the end. It's kind of a series of pictures. And when you think about your life, that's kind of how you picture your life and the sequence of your life. But it is a sequence, and when you're in it, you're in that fog and you remember the past, you think about the future, but all you really experience is the present. Well, it's not that way with God. God sees the movie of your life all at one time. God has no night, He has no day, He has no month. He has no year. He has no present. He has no past. He has no future. And the theological word for this is the transcendence of God, which means He lives in a realm that's beyond our human experience. So Esther and Mordecai were just like us. They were kind of living in this fog of their present life through these chapters that we've discussed. You know, remembering the past, wondering about the future, especially with this edict about all the Jews being killed in 11 months, wondering how that's going to play out. But as Mordecai expressed in one of the earlier chapters, he says, I don't know who's going to save us. This is when he's sending a message to Queen Esther. He said, Esther, I don't know if you can save us, but God is going to save us. And we mentioned before that God protects His people. You know, He's protecting the lineage of Christ. And that's what all this is about. God has a plan. God has a purpose for His people, especially the Jews in the Old Testament, because He's protecting the lineage of Christ. He's not going to let them get wiped out. So Mordecai had that and that belief and said that. But still, they're waiting. They're in this fog. They're swimming, doing what they think they need to be doing, trying to live in faith, do the right thing, but they can't see the future. But then finally, in this chapter, God is no longer silent. The fog lifts, and they see God move. And it's wondrous. It's wondrous when that happens. So we're much like Esther and Mordecai. I've got an excerpt from a book. Philip Yancey, he's a Christian writer, got some really good books. One you may have heard of, he wrote several years ago, is called Where is God When It Hurts? He's written quite a few books, and they're really good books if you're looking for something to read. That's a great complement to your biblical study. This one is from his book called Disappointment with God, and it kind of falls into place with what we're talking about, our being trapped in time and trapped in the present and trying to understand how we live with that. Let's read that. No matter how we rationalize, God will sometimes seem unfair from the perspective of a person trapped in time. Only at the end of time, after we have attained God's level of viewing, after every evil has been punished or forgiven, every illness healed, and the entire universe restored, only then will fairness reign. Then we will understand what role is played by evil and by the fall and by natural law in an unfair event like the death of a child. Until then, we will not know and can only trust in a God who does know. We remain ignorant of many details, not because God enjoys keeping us in the dark, but because we have not the faculties to absorb so much light. At a single glance, God knows what the world is all about and how history will end. But we are time-bound creatures. We have only the most primitive manner of understanding. We can let time pass. Not until history has run its course will we understand how all things work together for good. Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. So, as we close tonight, we live in this foggy world of the present. And this world that we live in has a lot of pain. It has a lot of suffering. It has death. It has crime. It has unfairness. It has financial problems. It has alienation between friends and families. It just has disappointments by the dozen. And all of us experience those things. Nobody's immune. Just because you're Christian, you're not immune. We still live this human experience in this fog, swimming through the lake of life. And so, what do we do while we're swimming through this fog? What do we do while we're waiting for the fog to lift? I like the title of the book, one of the most amazing discipleship books I've ever read, by Francis Schaeffer. And he writes this about how Christians should live in a postmodern world. How do we live? And so the title of the book is, How Should We Then Live? How should we then live? Because the enemy wants you to live in anxiety. The enemy wants you to live in panic. The enemy wants you to live in fear. Because if you do, it doesn't matter if you tell your friends you're a Christian. You won't be effective. Why would they want to be like you? There's really only one valid answer. How should we then live as we live in this fog of this world, waiting for the fog to lift, waiting for God to reveal to us His grand plan? Trust God. We got to have the faith in God that He knows. He's in charge. God's in charge of this world. Just like He was in charge there with Esther and Mordecai. He knew all along what was going on. It didn't bother Him one bit that Haman was carrying on like he was carrying on, because God was going to take care of it. And we've got to have that faith too. So let's read one more time the last sentence of Philip Yancey's excerpt. Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. God is at work in your waiting, and you've got to believe that. And we can't live a life of anxiety and fear and panic, or we'll lose our witness. We've got to be strong, be faithful, have courage, and believe He's on our side, He's for us, He's going to save us, and He will right the wrongs. Maybe not in our time, maybe not when we want it to happen, but it will happen.